Let's begin with something uncomfortable, because transformation almost always begins there. One of the most overlooked reasons people feel spiritually stalled, emotionally drained, or inexplicably blocked is not bad luck, nor a lack of talent, nor even external opposition. It's unconfessed sin, the quiet compromises we make that fracture our integrity from the inside out. Now, I want to approach that word carefully. When I say sin, I'm not speaking in the shallow cultural sense of rule breaking for its own sake. I'm speaking about deviation from what you know deep down to be right. It is the violation of your own conscience. And psychologically speaking, that is catastrophic. Your conscience is not your enemy. It is an internal guidance system calibrated to truth. When you repeatedly override it, you don't eliminate it, you damage it, you dull it. And when that happens, you lose clarity, you lose confidence, you lose alignment between who you are and who you claim to be. That internal fracture creates instability, and instability blocks blessing. So, consider this. You cannot knowingly live in contradiction and expect peace. The human nervous system doesn't tolerate hypocrisy well. When your actions betray your values, anxiety increases, you become defensive, you rationalize, you justify. You start constructing elaborate narratives to protect your self-image, and every layer of rationalization distances you further from reality. Spiritually, this is where distance from God begins. Scripture makes a sobering observation in Psalm 60:18. If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. That isn't divine cruelty. It's a statement about alignment. If you cling to what corrupts you, you are choosing separation. God does not force intimacy on a divided heart. And here's the deeper issue. Small sins are never small. They reshape your character. Character is built through repeated action. Every compromise strengthens a pattern. Every justification makes the next one easier. Eventually, what once troubled you no longer even registers. That's how hearts harden. You see it in everyday habits, the quiet dishonesty in business, the subtle manipulation in relationships, the private indulgences no one else sees, the resentment you nurse but refuse to confront. None of it feels catastrophic in the moment. But over time, it builds a wall, brick by brick, between you and the life you say you want. And here's the paradox. People pray for blessing while protecting the very thing that's blocking it. They ask for peace while harboring deceit. They ask for clarity while entertaining corruption. They ask for clarity while entertaining corruption. They ask for clarity while entertaining corruption. It doesn't work that way. Psychologically, you cannot move forward while dragging concealed guilt behind you. It drains cognitive energy. It fragments your identity. It forces you into performance instead of authenticity. You become more concerned with appearing righteous than being transformed, and God is not interested in performance. What He responds to is honesty. Confession at its core is not humiliation. It is reintegration. It is the courageous act of bringing what is hidden into the light so that it loses its power over you. When you confess, you stop defending the false self. You dismantle the illusion. You realign yourself with truth. And truth is where blessing begins. There is something profoundly liberating about saying, I was wrong, not as a ritual phrase, not as a vague apology, but as a precise acknowledgement of where you deviated from what you knew to be right. That moment restores internal order. It repairs the fracture between your conscience and your behavior. And when internal order is restored, external fruit follows. The reason unconfessed sin blocks blessing, is not arbitrary punishment. It's structural reality. A divided heart cannot steward abundance. A compromised character cannot sustain influence. A dishonest mind cannot handle revelation. Blessing requires capacity, and capacity is built on integrity. So the question becomes deeply personal. What are you currently defending that you should be confessing? Where are you rationalizing instead of repenting? Because as long as you cling to what deforms you, you will not fully experience what was meant to elevate you. This isn't about living in fear of making mistakes. It's about refusing to let mistakes define your trajectory. The difference between a stagnant life and a blessed one is not perfection. It's responsiveness. When correction comes, do you harden or do you humble yourself? One path leads to gradual decay. The other leads to growth, clarity, and renewed intimacy with God. And here is the remarkable promise embedded in this. The moment you bring darkness into the light, its grip weakens. The moment you stop hiding, healing begins. God does not reject the repentant heart. He restores it. But restoration requires honesty. If you want the door to open, stop bracing it shut with secret compromise. If you want the door to open, stop bracing it shut with secret compromise. Because the blessings you're praying for are waiting on the integrity you're avoiding. Now, once you begin removing what corrupts your integrity, you encounter something more subtle and in many ways more socially acceptable, yet just as spiritually obstructive: chronic worry. Most people don't think of worry as a moral or spiritual issue. They think of it as responsibility. They equate anxiety with care. If I'm not worried about it, I must not be taking it seriously. But that assumption is deeply flawed. Worry is not the same as preparation. It is not strategic thinking. It is not wisdom. Worry is the repetitive rehearsal of feared outcomes without productive action, and psychologically speaking, it is an attempt to control what you cannot control.
At its core, chronic worry is a trust problem. Now I want to be precise here.
I'm not dismissing clinical anxiety or the complexity of mental health. What I am addressing is the habitual posture of living as though everything depends entirely on you, as though if you loosen your grip for even a moment, everything will collapse. That mindset is exhausting, and it silently blocks peace. When you worry constantly, your nervous system remains in a state of hypervigilance. Cortisol rises, sleep diminishes, your body behaves as though danger is always imminent. Over time, this erodes your clarity of thought. You become reactive instead of thoughtful, impulsive instead of discerning. Fear narrows perception, and spiritually, that narrowing is devastating, because when fear dominates your internal landscape, it crowds out your awareness of God's presence. You become so consumed with potential disaster that you lose sensitivity to guidance. You start making decisions not based on conviction, but on avoidance. You choose what feels safest, not what is right. That is how opportunities are missed. That is how callings are delayed. Worry convinces you that control equals security, but that's an illusion. Control is limited, fragile, temporary. The more tightly you try to grip every outcome, the more fragile you feel, because deep down you know you cannot manage every variable. So what do people do? They escalate the mental rehearsal. They replay worst-case scenarios. They imagine conversations that haven't happened. They attempt to pre-live every possible failure so they won't be caught off guard. But here's a paradox. Rehearsing catastrophe does not prevent it. It conditions you to expect it. And expectation shapes perception. When you habitually expect loss, you interpret ambiguity as threat. When you expect betrayal, you see suspicion everywhere. When you expect collapse, you sabotage stability. Worry becomes self-fulfilling because it distorts how you engage the present. Self-fulfilling because it distorts how you engage the present. Scripture repeatedly calls for trust, not passive irresponsibility, but active dependence. Trust means you take responsible action where you can, and you release what you cannot govern. Worry refuses that release, which is that release. It says, if I don't hold this together, no one will. And subtly, often unintentionally, it pushes God out of the equation, not through rebellion, but through overfunctioning. And overfunctioning is a form of pride disguised as diligence. It assumes you are the ultimate stabilizing force in your life. But you are not designed to carry that weight when you attempt to use strain under pressure that was never meant for you. There is also a deeper philosophical issue at play. Worry anchors you in a hypothetical future. It robs the present of attention. And meaning is always constructed in the present moment. If your consciousness is perpetually occupied by imagined futures, you cannot fully inhabit the responsibility of today. And blessings often arrive disguised as present responsibilities. The conversation you're too distracted to engage. The opportunity you're too fearful to pursue. The insight you're too anxious to notice. Worry narrow. Was your world until survival becomes your only priority. But you were not designed merely to survive. You were designed to grow, to build, to serve, to trust. Now here's the crucial distinction. Planning is disciplined thought directed toward constructive action. Worry is undisciplined thought spiraling toward paralysis. The other drains it. When you choose trust, you are not denying uncertainty. You are acknowledging it and then placing ultimate confidence in something greater than your limited foresight. Trust reorients your nervous system. It restores calm. It expands perception. It allows you to respond thoughtfully rather than react fearfully. And that shift changes everything, because peace is not just a pleasant emotion. It is a cognitive advantage. It sharpens judgment. It enhances relational stability. It strengthens resilience. And spiritually, it positions you to hear direction clearly. If your inner life is constantly noisy with fear, how will you discern subtle guidance of guidance? So let me ask you something direct. What are you currently trying to control that you need to release? Where are you substituting mental agitation for genuine trust of a? You cannot pray for peace while feeding anxiety with endless rumination. You cannot ask for divine direction while drowning out stillness with internal chaos. At some point, you must decide that trust is not weakness, it is alignment. Because the life you're asking God to bless requires a nervous system capable of sustaining it. And that begins by relinquishing the illusion that worry is protecting you. It isn't. It's exhausting you. If you want clarity, if you want peace, if you want the kind of blessing that strengthens rather than overwhelms you, then stop rehearsing disaster and start practicing trust. Because fear tightens your grip, but trust opens your hands. Once you begin restoring integrity and loosening your grip on worry, you encounter another obstruction that is far more corrosive than most people realize. Unforgiveness. Now this one is particularly deceptive because it often feels justified. Someone wronged you, they betrayed your trust, they lied, they abandoned you, they diminished you, and the emotional response to that is not trivial. It can cut deeply. So when you hold on to resentment, it feels like moral clarity. It feels like strength. It feels like you're honoring justice. But psychologically and spiritually, something else is happening beneath the surface. Resentment is frozen anger. It is anger that has been preserved and rehearsed. And every time you replay the offense in your mind, you reinforce the emotional charge attached to it. Neural pathways strengthen, the grievance becomes central to your identity. You start telling your story, that rough the lens of the wound that reshapes you. When you cling to bitterness, you are not simply remembering the past. You are reliving it. Your body reacts as though the offense is still occurring. Stress hormones rise. Your posture tightens. Your tone hardens. You carry the offender into rooms they have never entered because they occupy space in your psyche. And here is the tragic irony: the person you refuse to forgive often moves on, but you remain tethered. Unforgiveness feels like control, but it is actually captivity. Now let's approach this carefully. Forgiveness does not mean pretending the harm didn't occur. It does not mean reconciling automatically. It does not mean abandoning boundaries. Forgiveness is not naivete, it is not passivity. It is not passivity. Forgiveness is the conscious decision to release your demand for repayment. And that is profoundly difficult, because when someone harms you, there is a deep internal cry for justice. This must be made right. And that instinct is not wrong. Justice matters. Accountability matters. But when you internalize the role of ultimate judge, you take on a burden you cannot carry without it deforming you. Bitterness narrows perception. It distorts relationships. It bleeds into interactions that have nothing to do with the original offense. You become suspicious where you once were open, defensive where you once were relaxed, critic where you once were patient. That is not strength. That is corrosion. Spiritually, unforgiveness blocks the flow of grace because it contradicts the very mercy you depend on. Every one of us lives downstream of forgiveness. None of us are flawless. None of us stand purely on our own merit. If we demand absolute repayment from others while expecting mercy for ourselves, We fracture our moral coherence, and that fracture destabilizes us internally. There is also a philosophical reality here. When you define yourself primarily as a victim of someone else's wrongdoing, you surrender agency. Your identity becomes anchored to an event you cannot change. The offense becomes the organizing principle of your narrative. But you are more than what happened to you. Forgiveness is not saying the wound was small. It is saying the wound will not define the rest of your life, and that decision restores power. You see, when you release resentment, you reclaim psychological territory. You free cognitive bandwidth previously occupied by grievance. You reduce stress responses that have become chronic. You regain clarity in your relationships. You are no longer interpreting every interaction through the lens of past betrayal. Now, none of this happens instantly. Forgiveness is often iterative. It may require repeated decisions as emotions resurface, but each time you choose release instead. Add of rehearsal, you weaken the grip of bitterness. There is also something deeply transformative about recognizing your own fallibility in the process. Not in a way that minimizes what was done to you, but in a way that cultivates humility. You too have wounded others, intentionally or unintentionally. You too rely on patience and understanding. That recognition softens the heart, and a softened heart is receptive to blessing. When bitterness dominates, you cannot fully receive joy. Suspicion interrupts trust. Cynicism interrupts gratitude. You may achieve success externally, but internally there is a guardedness that prevents peace from settling deeply. Ask yourself honestly, who are you still mentally arguing with? Whose name changes your tone when it comes up of K? What memory still ignites anger years later? Those emotional reactions are indicators. They reveal unresolved attachments to pain. And as long as you grip that pain, it shapes you. You cannot step into fullness while dragging chains from the past. Forgiveness does not erase history. It transforms your relationship to it. It allows you to say, what happened was real. It mattered. It hurt. But it will not govern my future. That is strength. And it is freedom. If you want to remove one of the most silent yet powerful blocks to blessing, examine your resentments carefully, not to justify them further, but to decide whether carrying them is still worth the cost. Because bitterness feels like armor, but it functions like poison, and the person it poisons first is you. Release the debt, free your heart, and refuse to let yesterday's wound sabotage tomorrow's blessing. After you begin restoring integrity, loosening the grip of worry, and releasing resentment, you might assume the pathway to blessing is now clear. But there is another obstruction, quieter, less dramatic, and therefore often more dangerous. It's the slow neglect of time with God, not rebellion, not defiance, just neglect, and neglect is insidious because it feels harmless in the moment. You skip prayer today because you're tired. You postpone reflection because you're busy. You scroll instead of sitting in silence. You tell yourself you'll reconnect tomorrow, and tomorrow becomes a pattern. What's happening psychologically in that process is subtle but profound. Your attention is being trained. Whatever you consistently attend to reshapes your internal hierarchy of value. If your mind is saturated with noise, news cycles, social media, endless productivity metrics, your inner world becomes fragmented. You lose depth, You lose stillness. You lose orientation. And without orientation, you drift. Human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We require a coherent framework that orders our perception and guides our decisions. Historically and spiritually, that framework has been grounded in regular communion with God. Prayer, scripture, meditation, silence. Not as ritualistic obligation, but as recalibration. Because life destabilizes you. Conflict destabilizes you. Success destabilizes you. Success destabilizes you. Suffering destabilizes you. Without intentional recalibration, your internal compass begins to spin according to cultural pressure rather than divine direction. Now, here's the psychological reality. The mind does not tolerate a vacuum. If you do not deliberately fill it with truth, it will be filled with whatever is loudest. And what is loudest is rarely what is wisest. When you neglect time with God, your discernment weakens. Not instantly, gradually, you begin making decisions primarily on impulse or external validation. You become more reactive to opinion, more sensitive to criticism, more driven by comparison. Why? Because your identity is no longer being anchored in something transcendent. It's being shaped horizontally by the shifting standards of the environment around you. Silence with God restores vertical alignment. It reminds you who you are. It reminds you what matters. It reminds you what matters. It reminds you what matters. That your worth is not contingent upon performance or applause. That recalibration stabilizes the psyche. It reduces the frantic need to prove yourself. It tempers ambition with humility. It balances urgency with patience. And here is the crucial point. Blessing requires discernment. Opportunities are not always obvious. Sometimes what looks attractive is destructive. Sometimes what feels inconvenient is actually calling. If you are not cultivating sensitivity to God's voice, you will struggle to differentiate between the two, and that differentiation determines the trajectory of your life. Busyness compounds the problem. Modern culture rewards constant motion. Productivity is celebrated. Stillness is treated as laziness, but relentless activity without reflection produces shallow results. You can climb very quickly and discover you're leaning against the wrong wall. Time with God is not inefficiency. It is strategic clarity. Think of it this way. If you were responsible for constructing a complex structure, you would regularly consult the blueprint. You would measure twice before cutting once. You would verify alignment before adding weight. Prayer and Scripture function as that blueprint consultation. They prevent misalignment before it becomes collapse. Neglecting that process does not eliminate consequences. It delays awareness of them. There is also something neurologically powerful about contemplative practice. Regular quiet reflection lowers stress responses, strengthens attention regulation, and enhances emotional stability. When that reflection is oriented toward transcendent truth, it deepens humility and gratitude. You become less reactive, more grounded, more thoughtful. And grounded people are capable of sustaining blessing without being destroyed by it. Consider how many lives unravel not because opportunity never came, but because character was not deep enough to support it. Without spiritual depth, success amplifies insecurity. Influence magnifies ego. Pressure exposes fragility. Time with God builds depth. It confronts pride. It reveals blind spots. It corrects subtle drift. It realigns desire. It softens the heart. It renews courage. But none of that happens accidentally. You must choose it. You must create space for it. And that choice often feels inconvenient precisely because it competes with immediate stimulation. Silence can feel uncomfortable if you're unaccustomed to it. Reflection can feel confronting if you've been avoiding self-examination. But that discomfort is not harm, it is refinement. So let me ask you directly, when was the last time you were truly still? Not distracted prayer, not rushed reading, not multitask devotion, but deliberate, attentive presence. If your schedule is too full for difficult, it is too full for wisdom. The life you are building requires more than ambition. It requires alignment. And alignment does not occur in chaos. It occurs in communion. You cannot expect clear direction if you rarely pause to listen. You cannot expect deep peace if you are perpetually immersed in noise. Neglect may feel minor, but over time it produces spiritual dullness. And dullness makes you vulnerable to drift. Reclaim your stillness. Reestablish your rhythm of communion. Because when you make space for God consistently, you sharpen the very faculties required to steward the blessings you seek. If you want clarity, create quiet. If you want direction, cultivate devotion. Because a distracted life cannot discern a divine one. As you begin to reestablish integrity, replace worry with trust, release resentment, and cultivate stillness with God, you will inevitably confront something even more deeply embedded in the human condition: pride. Now, pride is particularly difficult to identify in yourself because it rarely announces its presence. It disguises itself as confidence, as independence, as competence, as competence. And to be clear, strength and competence are not the problem. The issue arises when self-reliance subtly replaces God dependence, when your success convinces you that you are self-sustaining. Pride is not merely thinking highly of yourself. It is thinking of yourself as the ultimate reference point. Psychologically, pride creates a closed system. Feedback becomes threatening. Correction feels insulting. Accountability appears unnecessary. The proud individual does not easily admit error because error destabilizes their self-concept. So instead of adjusting, they defend. Instead of listening, they argue. Instead of learning, they rationalize. And over time, that defensiveness isolates them. Isolate is one of pride's quiet consequences. If you cannot be corrected, you cannot grow. If you cannot admit weakness, you cannot receive help. And if you cannot receive help, your development plateaus at the edge of your own limitations. Spiritually, this becomes even more consequential. Dependence on God requires humility because it requires acknowledgement of limitation. It requires the admission that your perspective is finite, your strength fluctuates, your motives are not always pure, and your understanding is incomplete. That acknowledgement is not degradation. It is accuracy. But pride resists accuracy. It prefers the illusion of control. It prefers the narrative of self-sufficiency. It says, I've built this, I've achieved this, I've sustained this. And while effort absolutely matters, pride forgets contingency. It forgets how much of life is gift, opportunity, timing, health, mentorship, grace. When you begin attributing everything solely to your own brilliance or discipline, gratitude diminishes. And when gratitude diminishes, entitlement grows. Entitlement is toxic to blessing. Because blessing, by its very nature, is something received. And you cannot genuinely receive what you believe you inherently deserve. You will either minimize it or demand more of it. There is also a philosophical problem with pride. It distorts perception. When you are excessively preoccupied with maintaining superiority, you interpret disagreement as attack. You perceive equals as threats. You treat subordinates as extensions of your will rather than individuals of intrinsic value. That erodes relationships. The proud person may accumulate achievement, but they struggle to cultivate deep trust. Why? Because trust requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to say, I was wrong. It requires the willingness to say I was wrong. It requires openness to influence. Pride experiences those as weakness. But paradoxically, they are the foundation of strength. Humility is not self-contempt. It is calibrated self-assessment. It is the ability to recognize both capacity and limitation without distortion. It allows you to say, I am capable, but I am not ultimate. I am responsible, but I am not sovereign. That posture creates psychological flexibility. It enables learning. It invites mentorship. It sustains growth across decades instead of years. And here's something critical. Pride often increases with success. Early in life, when you are struggling, you pray intensely. You seek guidance. You acknowledge your need. But as stability increases financially, professionally, socially, the urgency of dependence fades. You begin consulting yourself more than God. You begin trusting your instincts more than wisdom. Gradually, subtly, prayer becomes optional. Reflection becomes sporadic. Gratitude becomes assumed, and that is where decline begins. Assumed. And that is where decline begins. History is filled with examples of individuals who rose quickly and collapsed spectacularly, not because they lacked talent, but because pride eroded their judgment. It amplified blind spots. It silenced advisors. It magnified risk-taking without caution. Pride pushes away the very voices that could protect you. And spiritually, there is a sobering principle. God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. That resistance is not arbitrary punishment. It is structural opposition to distortion. Pride inflates the self beyond proportion. Reality inevitably corrects inflation. The higher you elevate yourself internally, the more devastating correction becomes. So the question is not whether you possess ability. The question is whether you remember its source. Can you succeed without becoming arrogant? Can you lead without becoming domineering? Can you be confident without becoming unteachable? Humility attracts help. It invites collaboration. It sustains intimacy. It allows you to receive correction without collapse. It keeps your identity anchored beyond achievement. And perhaps most importantly, it keeps you receptive to God's direction. If you already believe you know everything necessary, you will not seek further wisdom. If you already believe you are sufficient, you will not ask for strength. And if you stop asking, you stop growing. So examine yourself carefully. Where do you resist feedback? Where do you silently believe you are above instruction? Where have you subtly replaced gratitude with entitlement? These are diagnostic questions, not for shame, but for recalibration, because pride does not merely block blessing. It destabilizes it. Even if opportunity comes, you will not be able to steward it wisely if your ego must constantly be fed. Humility, on the other hand, creates stability. It roots you deeply enough that success does not intoxicate you and failure does not destroy you. If you want sustained blessing, not momentary elevation, but enduring strength, then cultivate the discipline of lowering yourself voluntarily before life forces you to. Because what you refuse to humble, reality will eventually humiliate. And the choice between those two is entirely yours. After integrity is restored, worry confronted, bitterness released, stillness reclaimed, and pride examined, there remains one final obstruction, and it is perhaps the most deceptively rationalized of them all. Delayed obedience, not rebellion, not open defiance, just postponement. You know what you should do, you've sensed it repeatedly. The conversation you need to initiate, the habit you need to break, the step of faith you need to take, the apology you need to offer, the boundary you need to establish, the calling you need to establish, the calling you need to pursue. It's not vague, it's not mysterious, it's clear enough, but you hesitate. You tell yourself you're waiting for the right timing, the right mood, the right confirmation, the right set of circumstances, and on the surface, that appears prudent. After all, impulsivity is not wisdom, but there's a critical distinction between thoughtful timing and disguised avoidance. Delayed obedience often masks fear. Psychologically, avoidance is a short-term anxiety reducer. When you postpone a difficult action, your immediate stress decreases. You feel relief, but that relief reinforces the avoidance pattern. Your brain learns that delay equals safety. And over time, your tolerance for discomfort shrinks. The result is stagnation. You begin constructing elaborate justifications for inaction. I need more preparation. I'm not ready yet. What if it fails? What if people misunderstand? And while preparation has its place, perfectionism frequently hides beneath it. You convince yourself that more knowledge will eliminate risk. It won't. Every meaningful step forward involves uncertainty. Spiritually, obedience is rarely about complete information. It's about trust. When you sense a directive aligned with truth and conscience, your responsibility is response, not exhaustive control over the outcome. But delayed obedience attempts to negotiate with clarity. It says, I'll follow eventually, and that subtle postponement has consequences. Momentum matters in the development of character. When you act promptly on conviction, you strengthen courage. When you delay repeatedly, you strengthen hesitation. And hesitation accumulates. Think of it this way. Every time you override your conscience prompting toward action, you slightly dull its authority. The next time, it's easier to ignore. And eventually, what once felt urgent feels optional. That is how callings are abandoned. There is also a philosophical reality here. Action solidifies identity. You do not become courageous by contemplating courage. You become courageous by acting in spite of fear. You do not become disciplined by admiring discipline. You become disciplined by admiring discipline. You become disciplined by choosing structure when comfort beckons. Obedience is the mechanism through which potential becomes reality. Without it, you remain perpetually conceptual, full of intention, low on transformation. Full of intention, low on transformation. And here is the deeper issue. Blessings often exist on the other side of decisive action, not because God withholds arbitrarily, but because growth requires participation. If the next stage of your life demands greater maturity, courage, or responsibility, then stepping into it necessitates movement. You cannot experience the stability of obedience while living in the ambiguity of delay. Delayed obedience also erodes self-trust. When you consistently fail to act on your own convictions, you begin to doubt your capacity to follow through. Confidence diminishes. You start identifying as someone who almost does things. And that identity becomes self-fulfilling. But the reverse is equally true. When you act even imperfectly, you reinforce agency. You prove to yourself that discomfort is survivable. You expand your threshold for uncertainty, and with each decisive step, your internal strength grows. There is a reason clarity often increases after obedience rather than before it. Action generates feedback. It reveals new information. It corrects false assumptions. Waiting for total certainty before acting ensures perpetual waiting. So the question becomes direct and uncomfortable. What have you been postponing that you already know you need to address? Sidon, where have you substituted analysis for action? What conversation remains unsaid because confrontation feels inconvenient? What opportunity remains unexplored because failure feels threatening? You must understand something essential. Partial obedience is still disobedience, not in a condemnatory sense, but in a structural sense. If you move halfway toward what you know is right and stop, you remain misaligned. And stop, you remain misaligned. This doesn't mean recklessness. It means responsiveness. When conviction is clear and aligned with truth, delay becomes costly, not always immediately, but cumulatively. Weeks become months, months become years. And one day you look back and realize the life you envisioned remained conceptual because you never stepped forward decisively. Obedience is not about earning blessing. It is about positioning yourself to receive it. It is about aligning your behavior with your highest understanding of truth. And alignment produces strength. If you want transformation, act. If you want clarity, move. If you want growth, respond. Because life rarely changes through prolonged contemplation alone. It changes when intention meets action. The door in front of you will not open because you admire it. It will open when you turn the handle. So stop negotiating with what you already know. Take the step, because the blessing you're waiting for may be waiting on you.